Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Gwei Refuel, where I recap the latest news in the Ethereum ecosystem. I'm your host, Anthony Sassano, and today's the 15th of December, 2021. Alright everyone, let's get into it. So last, kind of like warning here, there's just 2 days left to get your Gitcoin donations in, Gitcoin Grants donations in as part of this matching round. As you can see here, there's already been 300,000 plus contributions and $5 million worth of funds distributed to open source and to builders. And once again, thank you to everyone who has donated to the Daily Gwei and ETHUB, of course. And, thanks to everyone who donated to all the other teams as well. I mean, Ethereum is nothing without its public goods, and we need to fund those public goods. I spoke yesterday about how there's a lot of stuff happening on the client front with the client incentive program. Well, Gitcoin Grants has been doing stuff like that for ages, and not just for Ethereum core clients, but everything that we consider to be essentially public goods. So yeah, I'm sure a lot of you have already donated, but in case you haven't, you've got a couple of days left, probably less than that by the time you watch this. So definitely go get your donations in before the matching round ends. If you do miss it for whatever reason, maybe you're traveling, can't access your funds, there isn't going to be another one in 3 months, right? They happen every quarter, so it's not the end of the world, but still good to always get your donations in. I did mine yesterday. I put it off as well, so don't think that I'm, even though I'm bugging you guys, I kind of like put it off a little bit too, but I got around to doing it, and the checkout experience was so smooth using zkSync. Honestly, like I had to deposit funds into kind of like zkSync to do it, but I quickly did that very easily. It got confirmed, and then I just really quickly did the donations to the grants in my cart, in my collection, I should say, which are in my cart, of course. So yeah, just a final reminder there for you guys. So an interesting tweet from DCInvestor today, who said, "We are 100% in the AOL era of public blockchains. Using them is slow and can be expensive. Exponential improvements are coming. Corporate participants want to fake open and permissionless, but have not truly internalized the Web3 user ownership value proposition." There's a couple of other tweets that blow this, but I do want to focus on providing some context around this. So I'm too young I was too young when the internet was kind of like really taking off in the 90s. I was born in 1992, so all through the 90s, I didn't kind of like follow the internet. I didn't, play around with it. I'm pretty sure I only got dial-up internet in like the early 2000s, so I definitely wasn't able to follow it along. I was just too young at the time. But from listening to people who were around back then, who understand kind of what happened back then, it's really cool to kind of like look at history and compare it and contrast it to what's happening with blockchains today. So for those of you who don't know, AOL, CompuServe, I even think Yahoo, maybe some others out there, they had their own corporate kind of like internets, corporate versions of the internet that some of them let you access TCP/IP, which was the open internet, but I don't think AOL did. It kind of like wanted to lock you into its walled garden and wanted to serve you whatever kind of like things that they created for you, and they didn't want you going outside of that. Now, that still exists in tech today. A lot of it still exists. Actually, you can point it to Apple as one of these kind of like walled garden closed ecosystems, whereas Android is more of an open one. This isn't to say that walled gardens and closed ecosystems are necessarily bad. They have their pros and cons, but I think for kind of like things like open protocols, like the internet, these things were never going to win. So AOL, CompuServe, all those things, they lost to the open internet for a variety of reasons. But I think that the main reasons were that obviously the open internet was open, right? Anyone could build on it. Anyone could use it. It was credibly neutral. It was permissionless. It was kind of like this shared infrastructure. There was no need to get permission from anyone. There was no need to kind of like buy into any kind of one corporate kind of like system. You could essentially build whatever you wanted on it as part, and then, obviously the web came a little bit later, and then Web 1, Web 2, and now Web 3. The rest is history. So I think when we kind of like draw parallels to crypto today, you obviously have Ethereum, which is like the internet, right? It's open, public, permissionless, credibly neutral, but it's slow and expensive today, right? There's like the early internet was slow and expensive. I mean, even before dial-up, like 56K modems, and then dial-up, and finally broadband, but even broadband was slow for a long time because it just piggybacked off of the phone line, and it still used copper. When we finally got to kind of like fiber connections and more powerful wireless connections, at least in parts of the first world, I know there's still very uneven kind of distribution there with the internet. We got to a place where it was really quick and kind of like not expensive, or very cheap, depending on where you are. Like some places are still slow and expensive. Obviously it varies a lot from place to place, but mostly in the first world countries, they're pretty decent, right? It's not like you have to spend like what you do on Ethereum today to use it, right? Where it's you basically, if you think of buying Ethereum block space as kind of like buying bandwidth. I mean, it's not the best analogy, but if you think of it like that, well, to get to do one transaction on Ethereum, like a swap, it's like $50, right? Imagine having to pay $50 every time you wanted to sign up to a website. It's kind of like not a perfect analogy, but you get my point. So, but then we can kind of like look at what DCInvestor says next, where he says exponential improvements are coming. And they are. I mean, layer 2s are here and coming. They're exponential improvements. They are 10 to 100 to 1,000x improvements on layer 1 Ethereum. We have sharding, which is just going to, it's going to come later, but it's going to be even better. It's going to be that another exponential improvement. We have statelessness, which I think a lot of people still undersell how much improvement we can get out of that if done correctly, where we can jack the gas limit up of the blocks, and we can basically have a system where we have like big blocks, but also we have a sharded system, and also we have kind of like the roll-up centric roadmap. So we get to that point where we're having like millions and millions of transactions per second without sacrificing that decentralization and security of layer 1. Obviously, we push this all to kind of like layer 2. So that's the DC second point here. And then the third point is kind of like these corporate participants that want to fake, open and permissionlessness, but have not internalized the Web3 user ownership value proposition. This doesn't apply to everything. There are some L1s that I think this really does apply to, where they fake open and permissionlessness, but really they're not, right? They're not really decentralized. Like if there was a test against them from, whatever party it was against their decentralization, they would fail it. I think a lot of them would fail it. And they've given that up obviously for scale. A lot of them kind of like have on-chain governance systems as well, where there can be winners and losers in terms of like applications on there picked by the native token holders. They can actually censor and kick kind of like users off. Then you have, a bunch of other issues where sometimes some of these more scalable networks, they'll slow to a crawl and things like that, right? There's kind of like all these kind of like issues with that sort of stuff. And there used to actually be like a big push, not so much these days, but a big push around private blockchains as well, where people were like, these blockchain concepts cool, but it's not going to succeed if it's open and permissionless. It needs to be private, it needs to be regulated, blah, blah, blah. There's still going to be those things, but they're going to still plug in and use the credibly neutral infrastructure that is Ethereum. They're not going to exist in a vacuum on their own. We're still going to have Ethereum and other kind of like blockchains. You guys know that I don't believe most of these L1s are actually going to survive long term. There may be a couple of others that kind of survive and thrive for a little bit, but you guys know my stance on that, right? Like I believe that the L2 ecosystem is going to do a much better job there. But still, like a lot of these other L1s do feel very corporate, do feel very kind of like forced, and it doesn't lend themselves to attracting the right kind of community members and lend themselves to kind of like getting the right kind of builders as well, which is, I mean, at the end of the day, without builders, your chain's going nowhere because the users aren't going to come if there's nothing on your chain. And that's why becoming an EVM sidechain is very popular, because you can very easily give the option to builders to just redeploy their contracts on your new chain, and then the users follow that. But yeah, I mean, and then DCInvestor goes on to say, as I said, AOL was mostly a walled garden. It was like a BBS plus experience. It took time for people to become comfortable with the permissionless web, but first via Spry Mosaic on top of AOL, TCP/IP connection, and then Netscape took it mainstream. So I would encourage you to actually read about the history of the internet, like the early history, and see how it all unfolded, because there is a lot of similarities to crypto. It's actually quite amazing how many similarities there are. I'm not sure if there's any good TV shows around this. I haven't watched any around this. I think there's one that was recommended to me called Halt and Catch Fire, but I don't know if that was about the early internet as much as it was about early computers, because obviously you had computers that came first and then the internet came later to connect them. And the internet is just really just networking. I mean, the computers could talk to each other locally and things like that, but the internet is what really kind of like made it go mainstream. And I think, when you kind of like compare that to crypto, you basically have like Ethereum is this network that people can use. Obviously super expensive right now. It's kind of like slow, right? It's not very quick. You still have to wait, for a block to be mined, and you may miss a block because your fee's too low, all that sort of stuff. Whereas the L2s just take it to a whole nother level where your transactions are instantly confirmed with obviously delayed finality. But for most users, they're not going to even know about that. They're just going to see that their transaction was confirmed instantly. It's going to be really cheap, and they're going to get value out of that. So yeah, just an interesting tweet from DC here today that I wanted to cover on the refuel. Definitely, if you come across any kind of like documentaries or TV shows around the early internet, let me know. Even books, like I'm happy to read books as well. But I think I love the dramatization of TV shows and and sometimes documentaries as well, where they kind of like just make it more interesting than what it was. Like, it's interesting, but there are a lot of boring parts to it as well, where for a long time nothing happened, and then there was kind of a lot of corporate, BS that went on. We obviously have the dot-com bubble, which is kind of interesting to look at. A lot of people compare crypto markets to the dot-com bubble and say, okay, well, maybe 2017 wasn't the dot-com bubble, maybe we're in it right now. I mean, history rhymes, but it doesn't repeat. I don't know if we're going to repeat what happened in the dot-com era in terms of like the prices of things. But I do know that we're basically on track to repeat how the internet came to be in terms of things being slow and expensive to begin with, these kind of like corporate, fake kind of chains spinning themselves up to just kind of like with the main goal of just making lots and lots of money, and then them going by the wayside as everyone kind of got comfortable with the fact that, okay, Ethereum is kind of like, Ethereum and other public permissionless blockchains are the thing that we want to use, and we can use them for cheap with layer 2s. So yeah, anyway, moving on from that one. So Brantly from the ENS team put out a great little tweet today where he said, ENS DAO had no special early discounts for VCs. All initial token distribution went to users, contributors, and the DAO itself. And you can see here that there's a kind of, I guess, like graphic here from this website that he's linked to, where it's got a bunch of VCs and funds, and it's got projects that they've invested in. And you can see ENS, the project, is on its own, on its lonesome here. It had 0 VCs, which is very, very rare these days, guys. Like, as much as I do, it's very rare for a project not to get VC backing and fund backing. And I think for ENS, it made sense because they don't need it. Like, the amount of money that's in the treasury, or I should say ENS tokens that are in the treasury, and the amount of ENS tokens that were allocated to the team, they don't need funding. They have enough, right? And I think a lot of them are early kind of like OG ETH people as well. So I'm sure they've been able to kind of like sustain themselves that way. And the treasury also gets fee revenue from people registering ENS names and re-registering and stuff like that. And that can be used to pay contributors as well. So they really didn't need VC funding or anything like that, which I think is, I'd love to see more teams do this, but I understand why a lot of them don't. If we think about it, Uniswap, for example, like I'm just picking out Uniswap because I can see it here, they first raised in early 2019, where they raised $1 million from Paradigm. Then they raised it again before they did their token. But in 2019, it was like a different era. Like, if they had done a token back then, it wouldn't have been, its market cap would have been tiny. It wouldn't have been enough, right? But, I think they did a token at the right time, but they also needed funding. But not only was the funding kind of good for them, but getting Paradigm on board was very good for them, because Paradigm has helped Uniswap with a lot of their designs. Like, Paradigm is a research firm as much as it is a VC firm, and they've helped kind of like influence a lot of Uniswap's designs, especially around V3. So when you look at it from that perspective as well, it's not like these things are evil to have. It's just that ENS didn't need it from a monetary perspective, from a kind of like technology perspective. They built everything already, and they keep improving it on their own. They don't need these other kind of like VCs and stuff to help them. And if any of them want to help, they can kind of like apply to the DAO and get paid that way with ENS tokens if they want to. So I think I would love to see more teams do this. I don't expect most teams to do it, but I would love to see more of them do it, especially the core Ethereum public goods. I think, Gitcoin did it too, to an extent. They did have VCs on board, which is totally fine, understandable. But they did do it where they gave a lot away to the community, and they're obviously very community oriented. They were building for a long time, being funded by Consensus, and they wanted to spin out of Consensus, so that's why they went the kind of like funding route, because they have a rather kind of like large team. They had no idea what the token was going to be worth. Like, no one knew. Like, depending on when you launch a token and how you launch it dictates the whole thing. You can't rely on tokens in a treasury to kind of, I guess, fund you perpetually long term, without some kind of like backup cash there. So yeah, but still cool to see ENS there on its lonesome. It just speaks to how, I guess, community oriented it is, and how much they just cared about giving ownership over to the community, which is what we all want to see in Web3, of course. So another tweet here from DCInvestor, and this time he said, L2 to L2 bridges and their degree of decentralization, trust minimization, and minimal friction user experience will become the most important component of Ethereum infrastructure. Only a few people realize this so far. I would say that Refuel, regular Refuel listeners and watchers would understand this at this point, because I've talked about this a lot. Bridges are going to be the most important infrastructure for Ethereum. I believe this, and I've been saying it for months now. I think more and more people are waking up to this. And it's a simple fact that not everything is going to live on the same L2. Not everything is going to live on the same side chain. Not everything is going to live on the same chain. And you need a way to bridge in and out of them, not just your assets, but also arbitrary messages like relaying across, doing things like what Aztec Connect is doing with privacy at layer 2, tapping into layer 1, because layer 1 has over $100 billion locked in it still. There's so much liquidity on layer 1 because it's just whales. I don't care about paying the high fees, but let's not lock out the people on L2 from that. Let's see how we can tap into that, which is happening with Aztec Connect and a bunch of other things like Starkware's DAMM and Rari Capital's Nova, and there's some other initiatives out there as well, I'm sure, that I'm not mentioning right now. So from that perspective, just any kind of bridge or cross-chain swapper or cross-chain exchange is going to be the most critical infrastructure for Ethereum. In addition to the L2s, I kind of think about L2s and bridges as kind of like connected, because without the L2s, the bridges have nowhere to bridge in and out of, and they're kind of like useless. So they're kind of like live in a symbiotic relationship where the more L2s there are, the more bridges there are, the kind of like more stuff the bridges have to do. But on the flip side, the more kind of like bridges there are, the more kind of, I guess, like L2s people can kind of use, and the L2s get a benefit out of that. And, obviously the reverse, you can reverse that. But essentially, it's not a parasitic relationship. It is symbiotic, which I think is really cool. Now, of course, a lot of these L2s are going to have some of the same apps deployed to them. Like Arbitrum and Optimism are going to have very similar apps deployed to them, being EVM compatible and equivalent. And they already do. I mean, Uniswap is both on Arbitrum and Optimism. So I think there's going to be kind of like table stakes. So when you go to a new L2, you're just going to expect this core infrastructure to be there. You're going to expect Uniswap to be there. You're going to expect some kind of money market to be there. You're going to expect something like Curve to be there, right? And then you're going to have unique apps to those ecosystems where that'll dictate what chain or what L2 you spend most of your time on. Like, for example, Optimism, if you're into options, Optimism has Lyra protocol, Arbitrum has Premier. So, depending on which one you want to use, you kind of like choose an L2 from there. But again, you're not locked in. You can bridge, right? You can either bridge through L1, which is expensive, or you can use one of these L2 to L2 bridges, which are getting cheaper over time, to bridge between them and to use whatever you want. And also, as I said, with these arbitrary message relayers, you can actually tap into these other ecosystems without leaving your home, so to speak. So you could, once this stuff is rolled out, you could basically do a swap using liquidity on Arbitrum, but doing the swap from Optimism. So essentially, you're executing the kind of like trade on Optimism. You're sending the message to Arbitrum to tap into that liquidity, and then it sends that kind of message back, and the trade is all executed on Optimism, and you're all well and good there. You don't have to leave. That's going to be kind of like the future, I think. And all of this is going to be totally abstracted away. There's going to be interfaces that sit on top that do this all for the user. And it might even get to a point where these interfaces are running their own sequences or doing their own kind of like MEV. So instead of charging end users directly gas fees, they're essentially going to be covering the fees for the end users, but making it up somewhere else. This is kind of like probably 5 to 10 years out in terms of getting to that point. Maybe it happens sooner. I mean, I hope it does, because we're basically in the exponential age where things happen really quickly. If you're paying attention day to day, it may seem slow, but if you zoom out, imagine, look at the last year, how much has happened within crypto. If you zoom out in just a year, so much has happened, and I think that 5 to 10 years, we're pretty much going to be, pretty much mainstream. I would say that crypto has become pretty ubiquitous in 10 years' time, where it's basically integrated into every kind of like facet of the financial system. Maybe Web3 takes a bit longer to take off in terms of like decentralized social media and things like that, but I think it's all coming, and these bridges are going to work to connect all of it, and there's always going to be demand for them, and that's why I'm placing bets on bridges. You guys know I'm an investor in Connext, definitely farming airdrops on some of them, like Hot Protocol, for example, in case they do a token in the future. I don't know if they will, but a good astute Daily Gwei listener knows that every project is going to have a token except the Daily Gwei, so you may as well farm for an airdrop, using whatever heuristic you want to. So yeah. Anyway, gonna wrap that up there because there's a bunch of updates to get through. So Hashflow Network announced today that they're launching Hashflow public pools. So you get the same great set and forget it experience being an LP in an AMM, but with better capital efficiency and return on investment. So Hashflow public pools enables LPs to contribute tokens, single-sided LP by the way, to professional market makers and earn yields leveraging off-chain pricing strategies. Put another way, LPs can ape in eyes closed and let professional market makers do the work for them. So essentially, let me give you a bit of an example here of how this differs from something like Uniswap. When you liquidity provide on Uniswap, the protocol does all the work for you, right? It is an AMM, an automated market maker. It is two-sided. It's not single-sided. So if you were to do ETH USDC, you'd have to supply 50% ETH, 50% USDC, or I guess you can change the weights depending on what AMM you go into, of course, something like Balancer. But it's actively it's passively managed because it's all just done by the contract. Whereas with something like Hashflow, you contribute, your LP single-sided to these professional market makers who will then pay a yield to basically take your capital and market make with it. Now, this is incredibly powerful because it basically gives professional market makers a flush, a kind of like huge inflow of capital that allows them to do more than what they were able to do before in a kind of like, in a kind of like decentralized and permissionless way as well. So really, really cool to see this is public. I know it's been private for quite a while and they've done a lot of volume through this. It's kind of like similar to what 0x does. 0x has a network of market makers that execute trades. I'm not sure if it's public yet where people can provide liquidity, whereas Hashflow is. So I think that's just a really cool kind of like release here today from them. But anyway, I'll link this in the YouTube description and you can go check it out for more details. So EasyGNZLZ, their COO at POAP, put together this great thread today about how POAP is an ecosystem for the preservation of memories. So essentially, I mean, it's a 15-tweet thread, so definitely go give it a read. It was really great. But essentially, I mean, you guys know what POAP is, or POAP, whatever, however you say it. It basically allows you to get these kind of like NFTs that prove that you attended something, right? Whether that's an event, or you were kind of like a Genesis validator for the Beacon chain, or you kind of like did whatever. I mean, there's a POAP for watching the first 100 episodes of the Daily Gwei Refuel. You can basically have POAPs for anything. But the reason why I guess she's calling it a preservation of memories is because you basically not only have the proof that you were there or that you attended something or whatever, but you also have like a memory of it, because seeing that POAP in your wallet, seeing that NFT gives you kind of like a flashback to where it was, and it allows you to share these memories with other people. So it's kind of like a scrapbook for your on-chain identity, I guess you could say, right? Which I think is really cool. I mean, I've been a huge fan of POAP since day one, basically. I haven't collected as much as I should have. I don't have that many, but any time that I can get one, I try to get one. I love getting the ones from real life events, because when you go to a real life event and you get a POAP, I mean, that's a harder to obtain one, right? Like online ones are pretty easy to obtain, but like the real life ones are much harder because you actually have to go physically to the location, unless you do a dodgy and someone kind of like sends you a code. But they're pretty strict about that at the events. I've noticed that they don't just give out kind of like POAP QR codes to anyone. You have to kind of like be there, and you have to buy a ticket or whatever event it was. But yeah, I really liked how it was framed here by the COO here. So definitely go give this thread a read. I'll link it in the description. So MakerDAO's growth team put out a great tweet thread today about layer 2. So obviously we're all talking about layer 2s these days. I talk about it on pretty much every refuel. But in this thread, they break it down. Like, what is a layer 2 and what does it mean for Ethereum? Now, probably most of you at this stage, if not all of you, should understand what a layer 2 is. If not, I haven't done my job, but I'm fairly confident, all of you will understand what it is at this point. But if you want, I mean, this is an 18 tweet thread, so there's a lot of juicy info in here. If you want just like a breakdown of it with visual explanations of how it all works, you might learn something new as well. Maybe I've glanced over something. Definitely go give this thread a read. I'll, of course, link it in the YouTube description, but I think there's like a bunch of different ways you can learn about what L2s are. There's the very technical way, and there's kind of like learning by analogy, where people like to use public transportation as an analogy, and I've used it before, where basically I say that, driving a car is like L1, right? Because you drive your own car, it's expensive, you have to pay for the gas, no pun intended. You have to kind of like pay for servicing and maintenance and on-road costs and all that sort of stuff, right? Like registration. Whereas when you catch a bus, you're kind of like pooling it to get, together, where basically all the people catching the bus, split the payment for being on the road, essentially. And it can carry more people and it's much more efficient. That's pretty much what a layer 2 is like, right? Where we all go to layer 2, it basically splits the cost across users, it rolls up the transactions, and then posts the kind of like proof to layer 1 and post the call data to layer 1. So it's a lot cheaper for the end user. So I really like those analogies. I like learning by analogy. I think it's one of the best ways to learn. So yeah, it's definitely worth giving this thread a read, even if you think you understand layer 2s. I mean, we can always learn more, right? So I'll link this in the YouTube description and you can go check it out. So a fresh update from SpruceID, who are building sign-in with Ethereum. So they've got their updates here with roadmap updates. So the TLDR is that they're going to be adding Ruby support, which is a programming language, Rust support, and Python support, which again are more programming languages, and a Discourse plugin. So you can read this for the full kind of, I guess, like details on the updates here. And they're also adding a bunch of other languages as well, like Java, C#, and Elixir, which obviously for developers is really important. And a Discourse plugin, I mean, Discourse is used quite heavily within the crypto community for different governance forums, so it makes sense for them to have a sign in with Ethereum button here, or allowing Discourse admins to add sign in with Ethereum, because that is just kind of like more and more embodying Web3, right? Because if we're using these kind of platforms to essentially interact with, I guess, Web3 governance, then shouldn't we be using Web3 logins? Yes, and there just wasn't a way to do that very easily until now. So really cool updates out of here from SpruceID. Definitely give this blog post a read for more details. It'll be linked in the YouTube description. All right, so finally, I wanted to talk more broadly about Argent and their integration with zkSync, because I actually got access today to this on my Argent mobile wallet app. It's so smooth. It worked so well. I just had to kind of like create my zkSync wallet through Argent, and then I could deposit from my Argent L1 wallet to my Argent L2 wallet on zkSync, and then I was able to just like in a few clicks get started staking my ETH through Lido. I only had a little bit of ETH on there. As I've said to you guys before, I don't really use mobile wallets very heavily because I'm on my computer all the time. But you know, I tested it all out, and it was so smooth, and the fees were so cheap. It was like $1 to stake, and by staking I mean like in the background what it does is it basically trades your ETH for ST ETH, which is Lido staked ETH, and then I'm earning a yield on my ETH. There was also an option to do it through Yearn as well, which is cool to see too. And there's a couple of other things you can do on there right now as well, like earn yield on your dollars and things like that. But yeah, I mean, Argent quote tweeted and said, this is really the future of France. Their UX partnered with, or kind of like coupled with, the cheap fees of layer 2. And as I mentioned before, they're not only going to be supporting zkSync, they're also going to be supporting Starknet, Arbitrum, and Optimism, and I'm sure Polygon and things like that as well. They're going to be supporting all of that sort of stuff. But I think, as I think I've mentioned this plenty of times, it doesn't matter how good the underlying tech is. If the UX to access it is trash, then most people will get scared off. And I love MetaMask, right? I think it's one of the most battle-hardened wallets we have. It's secure. It works really well if you know what you're doing with it. But it is shockingly bad from a UX perspective for everyday users. Like, I'm talking about the users who spend no time in crypto, they don't care about crypto, all they care about is maybe getting a yield on their dollars. For them, using MetaMask is like the most alien thing in the world. What's a gas fee, right? Even just that sort of stuff. Like, okay, what's a priority fee? How do I edit this? Like, okay, well, what's this kind of like pending transaction? When it's going to be confirmed? And then it links you to Etherscan with all this kind of like stuff in the transaction details. I mean, new users are just going to not understand that at all, and they shouldn't have to. So from that perspective, Argent's taken the approach of, they don't even give you a seed phrase, Argent, right? They're basically like, let's make this so simple to use. Let's make Ethereum so simple to use. And the reason why they haven't really taken off yet was because of the gas fee issue, where they had the really awesome interface, but the fact that it would still cost a lot in Ethereum gas fees in order to kind of use anything scared off a lot of people, which is fair enough. But now with the L2 integrations, I think they're going to have some really nice growth going into next year, and they're going to be able to onboard a lot of new people that will never use MetaMask. Like, the reality is that most people will kind of like never use MetaMask and not use MetaMask and probably not even use like a native Ethereum wallet to interact with these things. They're going to use whatever's easiest. Now, I would prefer them to use something like Argent rather than a centralized exchange, but centralized exchanges have such a massive user base already, so they can leverage that in order to get their users to kind of like use them for things like DeFi. But Argent is taking the other approach where they're like, we believe in self-custody, we believe in users doing it themselves, but let's make it super easy for them to do that. Let's not just like complicate things for them. Let's not force them to use MetaMask or anything like that. Let's not even force them to use a hardware wallet, because Argent's wallet is it's on your phone. It's very secure. It stores the kind of like private key in the Apple Secure chip, I'm pretty sure. And it also has like this Guardian feature where you can have like multi-sig built in. It's a smart contract wallet, so you can have like whitelisting of addresses. They're doing everything right, and their security is much higher than a bank, right? Because they give you all those extra options. So really cool to see that. And just wanted to talk a little bit about that. But I think that's going to be it for today. So thank you everyone for listening and watching. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the newsletter, join the Discord channel, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Thanks everyone.